Hello everybody, my name is Ciaran Heatley. I'm one of the respiratory physiologists from the Mater Hospital. Nicola and the guys have asked me to talk about the dreaded pulmonary function test today. So in terms of the pulmonary function test, it's an integral part of the patient pathway for anyone with fibrosis. In particular, it's used in the diagnosis, but more importantly in the surveillance of the disease, because obviously your PFTs reflect the progression of the scarring and the fibrosis. So the problem with the pulmonary function test is that it's extremely hard work for the patients. Patients get out of breath, patients who have a cough, patients who have oxygen, they all struggle. It's all the patients dread coming to do their pulmonary function tests. I play rugby, I play Gaelic, I do the test 4 times a week. I don't enjoy it myself. It's not easy. It doesn't matter what age you are, how ill you are, if you're an Olympic athlete. When everyone does their pulmonary function test, they struggle. So today, the whole point of today is my talk isn't going to make your pulmonary function test any easier. It's just going to shed some light and show some method in our madness, basically, because it can come across as that, because at times it can be a bit of torture for the patient, especially if you're being made to take off your oxygen to do the test. It is hard work. So today's just going to explain to you what a pulmonary function test is and why we do it. There's going to be a bit of repetition, I'm afraid, because I know Professor O'Regan and Irene covered the physiology, but for me to talk about it today, I have to. So in terms of the lungs at the minute, this here is your alveoli. Now, these little sacs of air, they're 10 times thinner than paper. If you were to spread them all out in your lungs, it's the surface area of a tennis court in the normal human being. The problem is with the scarring, obviously, if you scar over the top of that, it makes it thicker. So obviously it's harder for the oxygen to get through. The second of all, the little pockets of air, the little bubbles of air, they can't inflate properly because obviously with the scarring, they become more rigid. And when they become more rigid, obviously they can't expand fully, and that means less air is getting in and less oxygen is transferring from the alveoli into your bloodstream. So the scarring does 2 things. It increases the distance for the oxygen to transfer into your blood, and the second thing is that it makes your lungs more rigid, because obviously if you get a cut in your hand, the collagen is quite stiff, it's rigid, so it's harder, so you lose compliance in your lungs. Now the reason I'm talking about this again is because what is a pulmonary function test? Well, a pulmonary function test is basically your car gets serviced once a year, you have your NCT. A pulmonary function test is a lung equivalent of an NCT, basically. So basically we look at how efficient your lungs are, how strong they are, the size of your lungs, is there any narrowness within the tubes within your lungs. Everything we need to know about the lungs in terms of mechanics can be measured from a pulmonary function test. Now, a pulmonary function test is made up into 3 parts. The first is spirometry, then you have your gas transfer, and then you have your lung volumes. There are the 3 tests in which you have done. Now, lung volumes is if you see the box here at the end, that's called plasmography. That is done, maybe you get that done once a year or whenever your consultant feels you need it. There's 2 other methods we use called nitrogen washout and helium dilution. You only have those done once a year, but the main tests that you have done are your spirometry and your gas transfer. Now, your spirometry, you've seen that the second value in there is called your FVC. So a spirometry maneuver is the one that everyone hates. It's the hardest one. It's where you take a big breath in, you blow out as hard as you can until you can't do any more. So we measure the amount of air you blow out in the first second, and then the overall volume of air in which you blow out. The overall volume of air in which you blow out is your FVC. Now you heard Professor O'Regan talk earlier about lung compliance and elasticity. Obviously with increased scarring, you lose that. Your FVC is a measurement. It is basically, it's the compliance of your lungs. That's why you have to have that test done every time you come. When you're doing the test as well, we do so many of each test to see if you get it right, and we're looking for what's called reproducibility, because obviously the more results we have that are quite close together, the more accurate the reading is, and we'll always push us every time to get the 3 results. Now the gas transfer result is one of the most important ones, because the gas transfer, you'll see it here, your TLCO and your DLCO. These are basically the abbreviations of what they mean. You don't really have to know what they mean. You'll hear your consultants talk about them a lot, and this has went down or it stayed the same. This is one of the most important values, because basically this is a representation of how well oxygen transfers from your lungs through those little pockets of air that look like broccoli I showed you earlier into your bloodstream. That transfer of oxygen through fibrosis basically obviously scars over the top, makes it harder for that to happen. So TLCO is a representation of basically the transfer of oxygen from your lungs into your blood. This is what a spirometry looks like. It's not the best image in the world, but if you can see, fibrosis basically creates what's called a restrictive lung disease. So with a scarring, you lose the compliance, the elasticity. So as Professor Regan showed in the X-ray earlier, you've seen the lungs shrink. So mechanically, your lungs shrink. So instead of being able to produce what they should do, the 5 litres in some situations, they only can produce 3. And if you can see from, this is what we look like. This is what it looks like when you do the test. So if you can see the big triangle, that's the normal flow volume loop from spirometry. And if you see the little one, not the dotted one, the little one, that's what a patient who has IPF or fibrosis looks like. So that's how we can tell on the day that whether or not a patient's done the test correct or whether they've done it right. The next test here, this is your gas transfer. I'm just briefly going through this because I just want you to know why we're doing this and what we're looking for. So if you can see the little jagged line there, that's your normal breathing, and then the patient expires out, and when they expire out, we have a gas mixture. Now within that gas mixture, we use carbon monoxide, which obviously carbon monoxide, as we know from all the adverts from the 90s about the fires, is poisonous, but we only give you 0.03% carbon monoxide to breathe in. Now carbon monoxide, you'd breathe in more from the car park than that, it's totally safe. Now, we know how much we give you, and then when you take your big breath in and you hold your breath while we're doing the test, that's when the carbon monoxide is transferring from the bag part of your lungs through that membrane that I showed you in the pictures earlier into your bloodstream. But obviously, if you've got IPF, that membrane is damaged, as in the oxygen can't pass through it because it's been made thicker. So it's transferring across when you're holding your breath, and then at the very end, when you blow out, you're not going to blow out all the carbon dioxide. So whatever the carbon dioxide in which we know how much we give you at the start, and then we know how much that you didn't use from what you've blown out, and we can work out how efficient your lungs are from there. And that's basically as simple as it is. That's how the test works. Now, I know it might seem a bit simple blowing in and out of the tube in terms of it is like a bit of a kid's toy, but these are the different lung volumes in which we can get from it. There's 8 in total there. I'm not going to go through them all, but it's just to let you know, it's a lot of information we can get from the pulmonary function test. Now, these tests in which we do, the pulmonary function test, they're based on reference values based on your age, your height, your gender, and your ethnicity. This is how we know whether or not you're abnormal or you're normal, or what percentage of the severity in which your condition you've got. And these are all, they're very much based, that's why you have your height done every time you come into the lab, because it's very sensitive, the measurement, because your height has to be bang on. So because obviously it can determine how big your lungs are. In terms of the test itself, now the test itself, like if I was to ask everyone in this room to stick their hands up who enjoys doing a pulmonary function test, I guarantee nobody would stick their hands up. Like, it is hard work. These are just some tips in which will help you when you come to the lab for doing your pulmonary function test, because a pulmonary function test, for example, a spade's a spade. You heard that expression. You either do it right, you do it wrong. There's no in between. The oldest person I've got to do a pulmonary function test is 97. So obviously, if that's the case, there's nobody really has too many excuses not to be able to do the test. I know when you're doing the test, the physiologist will know at all times whether you've taken a big breath in, whether you've exhaled properly, and if you haven't done that, you haven't done the test properly, and that's just the way it is. There's no sugarcoating doing a pulmonary function test. It is hard work. It doesn't matter if you're an Olympic athlete or you've got really bad IPF or you've got any other lung condition. Everybody can do the test. It is just extremely hard work. Now, these are just some tips. They're not going to make it easier, but these are just some tips that I should just to give you for when you come to do your pulmonary function test. Now, I've wrote up there food and hydration. So the reason I'm saying food is if you live close to the hospital and your appointments were 9:45, we don't expect you at 9 o'clock to have a full fry before you come to do your pulmonary function test, because obviously it'd be very uncomfortable. Hydration is also very important, because when you're doing the test and you're blowing off a lot of moisture, make sure you're well hydrated when you come. Bring some water with you, especially if you've got a cough, because it can irritate your throat as well if your throat's dry. In terms of supplemented oxygen, make sure obviously you have enough oxygen to do you for getting to the hospital. When you're within our clinics, obviously we'll hook you up if we need to. Make sure you have enough to bring you when you go home. For doing the pulmonary function test, the guidelines state that it's about 15 to 20 minutes we'll have to have you off your oxygen before we can do the gas transfer test of measuring how well the oxygen transfers from your lungs into your blood, the TLCO maneuver that I showed you earlier. The reason for that is because if you've supplemented oxygen, it will affect the results. And so that's why we'll leave you off it. But obviously that is a problem in itself, because you're going to get more out of breath from doing the pulmonary function test. And obviously it's just something that, as Irene was talking about earlier, the stall method. So when you're coming to do our test, things like that really matter. So the big thing with the pulmonary function test, because you get out of breath, if you get out of breath when you're tying your shoelaces, some patients in particular, when you're moving up and down stairs, you get really out of breath. When you're doing a pulmonary function test, you're expected to use 100% of your lung volume. When you're pottering around doing your day-to-day business, you only use about 50, 60% of it. So when you're doing a pulmonary function test, it takes you out of your comfort zone and you're not used to it. Patients who go to pulmonary rehab, for example, it's fantastic because the guys there get patients to come out of their comfort zone because they're pushing you. You're used to being breathless, so going to your pulmonary rehab classes will make coming to do your PFTs a little bit easier because you're more comfortable by pushing yourself and getting yourself out of breath. I wrote medication down there because our letters are a bit wordy, but make sure you take all your normal medication as always. Not many fibrosis patients will be on inhalers, but if you are on inhalers, make sure you don't take them in the morning before you come to test because obviously they can improve your results slightly. So, and obviously we want the results as reliable as possible. I've wrote up there relax and hard work, but that's easier said than done because if you've seen earlier, my diagram earlier, of the box there, it's not exactly the most appealing thing in the world. Being out of breath, being breathless is something that patients obviously will have to get used to from doing a pulmonary function test, but even though you're used to it anyway, it's a different level of fatigue in which you'll experience doing a pulmonary function test. It is hard work. So when I'm saying relax, it's easier said than done. I'm not on oxygen when I've done the test. When I was at college, we did a hypoxia test where they made us simulate what it would be like to have abnormal lung function and then do the pulmonary function test. It is extremely difficult, extremely difficult. When we're doing the test, my job is we're there to encourage you as much as possible to do the test. We're not like, you know, it can come across as we're torturing you. It's a bit like the enemy when you're in a pulmonary function test because it's hard work, but we're there to help you. The harder we push you, the more accurate the results will be. And the whole point of me coming today was just to explain sort of why we do it, how we do it. But now I want to have put it out to the audience in terms of a bit of questions in terms of, we want some feedback, what would make it easier, what do you find difficult about doing a pulmonary function test? So if anyone has any questions, go ahead, ask away.